Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's IGS Facebook Live event. We're thrilled to have you all here as we dive into a truly interesting topic, researching 19th century prisoners in the Indiana State Prison System. So if you've uncovered a criminal or two, you're going to be definitely interested in this. Some of you guys might just love the stories. So, I mean, this is going to be for everyone. So tonight we have a fantastic lineup of speakers with experience in navigating the complexity of these records. Kay and I are joined by Eden. Hopefully I don't butcher your name. Is it Kuhlenschmidt?
Kuhlenschmidt.
Kuhlenschmidt. Almost had it. Yes. And she's a retired librarian who will share some incredible stories about prisoners from the 19th century. And then we've got Vicki Castell, the Director of Patrons and Outreach Services at the Indiana State Archives and Record Administration. And she's going to guide us through the wealth of records available and how you can access them. And then we've got Diane Steppo, and she is the Genealogy and History Librarian at the Jeffersonville Township Public Library. And she's going to be covering how to find and utilize online records and how you can learn more about your ancestors in the Indiana State Prison System. So as we go along in this presentation, if you have any questions, please put them in the comments below. And we will try at the end to get to as many as we can. We will be monitoring them. And then also, if you want to share where you're watching from, we always like to know where everyone's watching from. And if you're watching this in the replay, go ahead and just type replay and where you're from. So let's go ahead and get started. If you guys want to go ahead, one of you guys want to start sharing the screen.
Okay. Hi. Whoa. There we go. Hi, I'm Diane Stepro, and we're here in Jeffersonville, Indiana, where the first Indiana State Prison was located. And because of that, our presentation is going to be focused on that first prison, but everything we're talking about can be applied to other institutions in the state, and you just have to think about switching the location around. So this is researching 19th century prisons in Indiana State Prison System. We'll be seeking burials in the old Prison South Cemetery and going beyond that. So the way this all got started was Francis, whose last name I will not try, of the organization Shrouded Veterans, contacted me, and he also contacted several other people around the state, I think Vicki and our county historian and a few other people, because his organization honors the graves of Civil War veterans. And they had learned of this Colonel James Trimble, who died at the prison, and wanted to honor him. And so the question came out pretty simple: where's the cemetery and how can I locate his grave? Trimble's obituary, which the organization had, recorded that he was buried in the Prison South Cemetery, and they couldn't find the Prison South Cemetery. They called us, naturally, people who should know where it is, and we couldn't find it either. It's been lost for quite some time, as far as we know. And this is the obituary that they presented that did not come from our local paper. We'll get into that more later. But Indiana's first prison, the Indiana Prison South, opened first in Jeffersonville in 1822. All the prisoners in the prison at that time, and through a lot of the 19th century, did hard labor. And most surprisingly, men, women, and children were all housed in the same facility, which was a log cabin facility, until 1873, or it was originally a log cabin facility. Later, it began to obviously have to grow a bit. In 1897, the Prison South facilities were converted for use as a reformatory for men ages 16 to 30. So in 1873, the women were moved out, I believe, but it continued to be a pretty rough place, with a bit of a national scandal, until 1897, when it became a much better place. I couldn't say that it was ideal, but they had vocational training, education, and abolished much of the really harsh punishment that had been typical of the prison before that, and moved some of the more older hardened criminals out with the hope of reforming some of the young men. That didn't last very long, as fire destroyed much of the facility in 1918, and then in 1921, the remaining structures were sold to Colgate, and a few years later.
Yes, I just found this out last week. The warden said that even though they'd originally planned to send all the prisoners to Indiana Prison North in 1922, there were actually prisoners, and he remained at the post at Indiana Prison South until October of 1923.
So in 1923, the last prisoners moved out, we believe. I say cautiously, on at least one site in the prison compound, officials buried the unclaimed bodies of dead prisoners. And I think all of us have looked into where that site might be, and Vicki might go into this more later, so I'll leave it at that. But at least one is probably the most accurate we can get at this time. This is what the prison looked like around 1900, the front facade. Now, we never found the cemetery, but we did find a lot of other resources. And the team that was looking consisted of me, Diane Steepro, and I'm going to be talking tonight about fire insurance maps and digital resources. Eden Coolin-Schmidt is here with me, and she's going to be talking about newspaper records and prisoner biographies. And Vicki Castile from the Indiana Archives and Records Administration will talk about their records and indexes. They have the original prison records, and I'm very envious. So, our combined records efforts resulted in a newsworthy index of deaths. So we put Vicki put together an index, Eden put together an index, and I basically made a place for both of them in the library. And NPR heard about it and ran a story about us. So if you would like to check that out, it's on Louisville Free Public Media site, and look for historians researching possible burial. It's site at the former Colgate property in Clarksville. And I was pretty amazed at all the interest it got. But let me begin my presentation and get through this introduction bit. So, first digital source I'd like to talk about is newspapers. The first newspaper resource I'd like to speak about is the Hoosier Chronicles. These are a great resource for Indiana research. They are free everywhere through the Indiana State Library. Newspapers.library.in.gov is the URL. The Indiana newspapers in this are searchable, much like any other database that you might have searched. And because it's statewide and free, you can look at the whole state at once, and absolutely anybody can use that and use it from home. Through many libraries, you could also use Newspaper Archive and newspapers.com. Those do cost you money for a subscription at home, but around here, I think it's pretty possible to do Indiana research for free with your library card, in Southern Indiana at least. Also, ProQuest Historical Newspapers often has Indianapolis and Louisville papers, which sometimes report on the prison south, and your library may have that, and it's a really easy to use database. And then through a few libraries, you might find digitized local newspapers. I'm thinking specifically of the Knox County Public Library, which has the Vincennes newspapers available on their website, digitized for a very long span of time. And then you can also refer to the book, The Indiana Newspaper Bibliography by John Miller, to determine when and where Indiana had newspapers when your ancestor died. I sometimes get people who are surprised that we didn't have a newspaper here in 1830, but sometimes we find articles about people here that far back in other places, newspapers where there was one. So it's a good thing to know when and where their newspapers could be. Now, what you will find in newspapers include obituaries and articles about prison happenings. And you want to try the prisoner's hometown paper as well as papers near the prison. Hometowns are most likely to carry a deceased prisoner's obituary. They occasionally show up near the prison, but many Indiana prisoners were born elsewhere, not near their prison, or they spent most of their years in some other state, so they might not even be from Indiana. I checked it out, and at different times, as many as nearly half of the prisoners at the prison south some years were not from Indiana. According to the census, at least, not born in Indiana. And then you want to be aware of aliases. They may appear in newspaper stories or prison records. You may get an idea from a newspaper that somebody had an alias, and then you can search the alias too for newspaper records, because they may have for a while been called one name, and then it's found out that they actually go by two names or three or four or more. And also, when you look at the newspapers, be prepared for disrespectful treatment. You will find gossip. Women prisoners, it was not uncommon to find gossip about how many husbands they'd had or affairs they'd had. Unsubstantiated gossip. Racism. Failure to use the prisoner's full name. Tasteless humor. You will not find your ancestor treated well in every case in the newspaper, so just be aware. Another good digital source is online books. Using Google Books, the Internet Archive, and HathiTrust, I was able to locate books related to the prison and search for information about individual prisoners, the cemetery, and prison conditions. The books I looked at included Indiana legal codes, annual reports from the prisons, reports from the Board of Charities and from general observers, including the Indiana Bulletin of Charities and Corrections, and histories, including the City of Dead Souls and how it was made alive again, which was about the prison reform in Jeffersonville, in Clarksville. Digital sources also can include images. Indiana Memory, you can just Google Indiana Memory and you will find it. It has lots of pictures of the prison. You won't find many of prisoners, but there are a few. You probably won't find your person identified in those pictures, but there are quite a few group shots. You can see them in the workshops, learning how to work wood and printing and doing other things in the vocational areas or in the schoolroom. You can see some concerts at the prison. archive.org sometimes has a few images, and you can just plain old Google things, because sometimes you may find an ancestor's photo. Just because they were in prison doesn't mean nobody ever took the picture. And you find things in family trees a lot by Googling. Another digital source is government death records from, and I waver a bit on this slide because some things are not digitized, but they are on microfilm, and I thought it was worth mentioning. So from 1899 to the present, Indiana death certificates are available via ancestry.com and Family Search. You could also call a county health department. And from 1882 to 1899, the county health department records are generally on microfilm. You could probably find them at libraries near respective prisons. You could probably also find them at other locations as well. I'm sure that they've been reproduced, so check around. Call the librarian in the area in the area of the prison where they were, if you think that they might have died in the prison. And from 1870 to 1880, you will find in 1870 and 1880, you will find the U.S. Census mortality schedules, which are available on FamilySearch.org. And the mortality schedules were lists of people that had died in the year previous to the census being taken. And they tell where they died. So we found some prisoners in the census mortality and schedules. And they can be a little hard to search sometimes. If you can find a print index, that's actually faster, but looking at them digitally is often the best that you'll be able to do, and it works, but you may need to look at them page by page because misspellings are really common in prisoner names. So you want to look, if you're looking for the whole prison, you want to look for terms like prison. If you're looking for individuals, type in their names. Same thing is true for the regular census. You can find it by individual or by prison, but you will find institutional people in the census in the place where they were institutionalized at the time of the census. So if they were institutionalized in 1880, they'll be in the census at that institution. And you will also find people that were in the institutional circuit. We find people that have gone from the orphanage to committing a crime and going to prison when they got out of the orphanage. And then when they get out of the prison, they go to the poor farm. And so you might find them in institutional records their whole lives. The census is often going to give you a lot of hints about a person. Their future burial sites or obituary sites could be hinted at by their place of birth, their parents' place of birth, their marital status. So they're looking for that spouse. For female prisoners, their childbearing history. If you see that a female prisoner in 1900 had 3 children and 2 of them are still alive, according to the census, try to figure out who those children are and where they are, because that might be where your female prisoner ended up with her children. I included this just because I thought it was very telling about the lives the prisoners led. In 1876, they were still doing hard labor, and you see the convicts were releasing groups of up to 100. Pretty severe sorts of lives they led. The last thing I want to talk about is fire insurance maps. These were hand-drawn maps issued throughout the late 19th and early to mid 20th centuries. They still make fire insurance maps, I'm pretty sure, but they are no longer hand-drawn. But they used to update them by pasting over things. So if a building burned, they paste in an empty lot. If when they came back to update them, or if a new building was put in, they paste in the new building. So they can tell you a lot about the physical surroundings of your prisoner, including the layout of the prisons. These can be found in local libraries. We have two. One was made in the 19th century, and the other was made in 1925 and updated in 1952. Many of these have also been microfilmed. The Library of Congress has digitized many of the maps and made them available online. And they don't usually tell you much about the cemeteries. It's very rare to find a cemetery on one, so don't think you're going to find that. But here is the Jeffersonville prison in 1886, I believe, was the date of this map. And you'll see it's a very large facility by that time with many buildings and a fence around it. You can see the fence in the image, and at the very bottom you'll see a railroad pass by, so you learn a great deal about their environment. And the buildings are labeled. I know there's no way your screens are large enough to see the labels, but you can, if you take a look at the online map at the Library of Congress and expand it a bit, you'll be able to see the different types of things that were done at the prison. Now I'd like to turn it over to Eden.
All right, turn this slightly so they can see me, and help you to have this over here. All righty, so I'm going to talk about the research I've done, and I need to let you know a couple of things. I index obituaries, not just the prison obituaries, and we're working on a database. Eventually we hope to get it online, but it covers from 1872, the first of the Jeffersonville evening newspapers, plus a few scattered editions of earlier papers. They may not have mentioned the prisoners, but it wasn't just prisoners at Indiana Prison South. There were also employees there, and there were contract employees also. And people might research that, and sometimes a prisoner turned into an employee, and sometimes it went the opposite direction. So it doesn't hurt to look up the names of people who are employed at prisons to find out information. So you can put their last name in plus Indiana Prison South, or reformatory as you get to the 20th century. I recommend looking family histories for convict information, and that City of Dead Souls is a good book to tell you what life was like in the late 1800s at the prison. It's whitewashed, but it still gives a fairly good picture of what life was like. In addition to the Jeffersonville Evening newspaper, which was my major paper for indexing, I also had the opportunity to look at the prison newspaper. They printed and published their own newspaper. It was an educational effort. It was called The Reflector. Now, I found very few obituaries from the prison in that paper, but I found a lot of articles about events, about learning opportunities. So if it mentioned a prisoner, it was in that they were doing something good and positive. So that, I think, is something to reflect on and look for that. The other, if you're looking for African American prisoners, in addition to the evening newspaper, you should look at the Indianapolis Recorder. It was, even though it was an Indianapolis paper, it covered African American news from around the state, and I found some obituaries in that paper that I did not find in the evening news. So I found that it was a good companion place to do research. And both of those are available through the Hoosier Chronicles. I've accessed them through Indiana Memories. So, all right, next shot. All right, so the first thing that Jeffersonville people knew about a prisoner arriving was usually an arrival notice. Now, not all prisoners got arrival notices. Here we have William Lowe from Daviess County. He tells us where he's from. how long of a term he's going to serve, what he did, housebreaking, and that he arrived in the morning. So he probably got on the train fairly early in the morning. A lot of times it'll throw in other information. They arrived in shackles, they were handcuffed, or they came on their own without even a deputy with them. It kind of tells the level of trust they had for an individual, that there were sometimes prisoners sent on their own here. This is also the place where if there is a known alias, it will usually show up. Okay. So that's arrivals. And I will tell you, I was going to follow William Lowe, but then I learned that there were 2 William Lowes in the prison at the same time. And there were multiple William Lowes in Clark County. I could never figure out which William Lowe was the one that I was trying to follow. So after that, I started looking around and I found a gentleman named Henry Berner. Now, Henry Berner is not a Hoosier. He was originally from the Cincinnati, Ohio area. As we delve into other accounts, we'll find out he actually wasn't from Cincinnati, but from a town outside of Cincinnati. And he was a barber. He moved to Vincennes, Indiana, and opened up a shop with a partner. He had a sweetheart, Katie Gannon, and according to the courts, he was convicted of murdering his partner. This article on the trial that was published in our newspaper in Jeffersonville included more details about the incarceration, how long he was in prison before the trial. It included more things about his sweetheart that we'll talk about in a minute, but it includes an account of the crime, details from the trial, witnesses, the judge, law enforcement, and relatives. Sometimes in other trial notices, we would find vital statistics including birth location, occupation, which we did have here, military service, spouse, and family members. In one case, I found a pet because the judge made arrangements for the dog to go to somebody else. So next slide, please. Berner wouldn't have interested the Jeffersonville, Indiana newspaper and folks as much, except for his fiance. Remember, I just mentioned her, Katie. Katie stood by him. She was there every day of the trial. If he wasn't in court, she was at the prison. And she impressed upon the judge such devotion that the judge, on the day of sentencing, but before sentencing, took Berner and his sweetheart into his chambers and married them. Many years, I'm sorry, let me go back there. Now, I did go and look up their marriage certificate because I had a date and a place. I found that according to the marriage certificate, a priest married them. So we have a mystery here. Whether the judge married them or the priest, I don't know, but the story is that they did get married and she followed him to Jeffersonville. So let's go to the next one. In addition to his wife, Berner, like most prisoners, had a mother. And his mother was thoroughly convinced of her son's innocence. She spoke broken English, but she was convinced that her son did not commit the murder and reached the point where she sold her home in 1886 and came from Ohio to Jeffersonville and had a lawyer prepare the pardon papers because the Ohio lawyers told her they couldn't prepare them for Indiana. He never got pardoned, but we'll continue that on. She returned home to Cincinnati where she lived with his sister, which comes out in another article. And in 1893, it was reported in the Jeff papers that a man had broken into the sister's home where the mother was by herself and convinced her that he had actually committed the murderous deed, that her son hadn't done it. And then by the time she got a grandchild to get the police, the man disappeared. So nothing else was ever said of that, but we know that she went through this very frightening experience of somebody breaking into the house. Next one. So all these years he was in prison. He eventually became, I think, the third or third most long-lived prisoner in the prison. And what was he doing? Well, he behaved himself enough. Let's go to the next slide. He behaved himself enough that he became a prison trustee. I was horrified and amused that in the 1895 prison, they allowed convict Burner to work as an armorer. And he had access to the rifles in the guards hall, where he would check them in and out and empty the bullets from the guns. It was reported that the weapon was accidentally discharged. Now I have to wonder how much he liked that guard. And the bullet, when a .44 caliber, went close to Guide Ralph Dale's foot and tore a hole in the floor. I'm betting they did not have a good relationship after that. So let's go on. Earlier newspapers mentioned that while a barber, he had a great deal of mechanical talent and could have been an inventor and made a fortune on his inventions. I didn't see any evidence of his practicing his barber skills in prison. In this slide, we see that Bernard did receive a commutation of his sentence from life to time served. And we learned that he had been, let's see, sorry, I got my things confused there. We learned that for many years that he was in charge of the prison boiler because of his mechanical knowledge. And I think go on to the next slide. Nope. And that he had made adjustments to the boiler to the point where nobody else really knew it effectively. When the lifers were moved to Michigan prison in the north, he was retained because he was the only one who could operate the boiler. So then, if you go to the next, he also became a quite talented woodworker and was trusted with a pocket knife. He assembled a clock that remained in a guard's family. The Herfel family had Henry Herfel had worked at the prison, and he purchased this clock from Burner. Burner also assembled bird cages, a guitar, and a guitar box. He evidently was quite musical, and he may have been performing in one of the bands of the prison. Other articles not shown here talk of religious services, a baseball team, complete with the names of the prisoners who played baseball, band and choir concerts, holiday celebrations where pies and desserts were supplied by local church groups. There were escape attempts reported in quite copious details and multiple articles that repeated many of the same things. In those, it wasn't just the name of the people who attempted to escape or who did escape. They would talk about the prisoners in the cell next to them or the prisoners who were witness to them killing a guard. It was quite an excitement for Jeffersonville when a prisoner escaped, and everybody was out looking for them. So they gave every piece of information they could to help find the prisoners who had escaped. In addition to the life in the prison, there were also other legal happenings that occurred. There were frequent reports in the paper of summons being served on prisoners, summons relating to other criminal trials, lawsuits, child abandonment, and divorce notices. So a good bit went on there. There were also, the warden had the sad duty many times of reporting on the deaths of family members to prisoners. And when that happened, they moved the prisoner to a separate cell next to the chapel, and there was always a chaplain from at least the 1880s, and the chaplain would work with the prisoner then. And I thought that was one merciful thing that I did not see evidenced much, other than that this chaplain would be there. All right, go to the next one. Release finally came for Burner, not through death or pardon, but through a commutation of his sentence. This article shows that upon release, he went to his mother's home in Ohio. This one. And the next article tells us that his wife met him when he walked out of the prison and accompanied him to Ohio. She had had quite a life. She had gone to Chicago to work after a while in Jeffersonville, and she couldn't find something. She worked with a circus, traveled the country, went blind, came back to Chicago, found out that her husband was still living, and then she came back to Jeffersonville and lived here until he was released. I didn't find much about Burner afterwards. They just kind of disappear from history. But again, there were rumors that he had come back to the prison and been hired as a trustee. They were simply rumors that were reported. I could not find anything to back that up. At this point, if I were doing a full person research, I would move to Ohio newspapers, census reports, Ohio and Indiana vital records. When I started the research for this project, I did not suspect finding information on personal interests or the amount of interest this man from another state or another county would create in the Jeffersonville papers. And now we come to where I actually got involved, and that's the death notices. Now, I have learned through experience that people who died in prison had multiple possibilities for burial. Number one, family members claimed the body and paid for them to be shipped home. This is in the era of the trains, and it was fairly inexpensive. You could get a body home and buried. If the family didn't have enough to pay for them to be sent home to be buried, they could pay for a prison-made coffin and be buried in the prison cemetery. That was an option. Or a prisoner might have enough money in their account to pay for a coffin made at the cemetery and for burial in the cemetery. Another option is if they had some money in their account and if the family requested it, they could be buried in a local cemetery. So we have prisoners buried in Eastern and Walnut Ridge and in Fairview and New Albany and the U.S. National Cemetery in New Albany. Then the final option is if there was no money, their bodies were sent to the State Anatomical Board for use in teaching medical doctors. This is Fred Weston. And Fred Weston, I reversed engineered. I found him in a coroner's report. And most of, if not all of the prisoners who die in prison were attended by a coroner. And so their reports are coroner's death reports. Usually they can be found in the same place, but the format's just a little bit different. But I reversed engineered and found him. And then I went back and I went up to a week after his death date and found the information that he had died. Now, Fred is unique in that he had two separate notices. He had that he had died at the reformatory and that he came from Evansville, Indiana. And I did check the Evansville papers in the Browning database and did not find him there. And if you'll go to the next one, he also had a burial notice. And it didn't say where he was buried, but because of that coroner's report, we know he was buried in the prison cemetery. Okay. Then most of the prisoners that appeared in the paper is because there was something that would touch the hearts of the readers, if you'll do this. They didn't want the people extremely angry at the prisoners because they didn't want, lynch mobs to occur. So usually they tried to find something that expressed the humanity of the prisoner to share. And Fred Palmer is a very poignant story. He served a certain amount of time in the prison and he was ready to be released, but he died on his last day of prison. And certainly that tugs at my heart. He was so close. I have a few other possible records and places that you can find deaths, and that would be if you know what denomination or religion your ancestor was that you're looking at, check in local church history records. Most ministers would record any funeral they did in those records. The other thing is, and moving into the 1900s, from about the time when the women's, about the time Michigan City was opened and the juvenile work farms were opened, anyone who had been at Indiana Prison South who died in those, we had a death notice in our paper because people had an interest in who was in the prison. So they would share that information. So I hope I've given you something to think about, some ideas and approaches that you can do in doing prisoner and employee records at Indiana Prison South.
We'd like to hand it over to Vicki.
He's muted.
Okay, now I think I've been able to unmute and share my screen. Can you,
Yes.
someone let me know if you see my screen okay? All right, great.
Yep.
Excellent.
That's
okay.
great.
Terrific. I had to get the right combination in the right order to make that happen. So let me go ahead and enlarge this. And I just wanted to tell you a little bit about our resources at the State Archives. and how we got involved in this here. So we'll start with what some of the resources we have available for the Department of Correction. We do have records for boys' school, girls' school, women's prison, and of course the Southern prison. You did, as both Eden and Diane have mentioned, that did house men, women, and children all at the same time. It was not a very pleasant place to be. And those early years, we don't have a lot of records for, but starting with the second volume of records, we do have um, a little bit more information, and I'll show you some examples from those prison registers here in just a moment. We have a variety of records depending upon which institution. The State Prison North, once renumbering began, we from 1897 to 1945, we quite often will have files, although some of those in the earlier years are sampled out and we'll only have one of every so many. We have records for the State Reformatory from the time that Jeffersonville Prison was converted to a reformatory in 1897, 1898-ish kind of time period. They did that because of all the trouble that they were having with prisoners. Some of the harder core prisoners were taking advantage of the younger prisoners, and also it was just becoming a very dangerous situation for them. So through some prison reforms, they were able to create a new reformatory and separated all the prisoners, keeping the younger ones at Jeffersonville and moving them from other prisons to, particularly Prison North, to Jeffersonville. And they just kind of swapped everybody out one day. We do have limited records for the State Farm, and then also records for life prisoners through the Board of State Charities accounts. And I wanted to show you a couple of our resources and where you can start doing the research. Actually, if you go to our website at in.gov/IRA, at the very top of the page, you'll see that link there for Archives Collections. Follow that, and then that gray box at the top, if you click on that, it'll take you over to the Research Indiana Index, or you can choose the Research Indiana catalog there if you're looking for a box level type of research. But if you're looking for individuals and you know who you're looking for, I really suggest you start with the Research Indiana Index.
Excuse me, Vicki?
Yes.
Hi, this is Kay. I think your PowerPoint needs to go to the slideshow.
It needs to go to the slideshow? Oh, you're not.
So. We can see the first one.
Oh, that's all you can see? Okay. Let's see. Let me see if I can figure out how to get. I had put it on the slideshow at the bottom, but let me try another option here. Let's see. Did that help at all?
Let's see. We're still seeing the one slide.
Okay. Let's see.
Did you try from the beginning?
Yeah, I had it set on the actual PowerPoint. Let me try. Oh, from beginning. Oh, you mean the actual tab. Let me try that. Did anything change this time?
Not yet.
Oh,
yeah, it's kind of been, we can see the first slide.
And that's it, huh?
Right.
Let's see. Let me take it off of the, let me try one more thing.
Okay.
Nothing changing yet, huh?
You can try clicking on that, the second part where it says Start Slideshow.
I think I have done that. No, now I can't find that though. Let's see here. I am not finding that option right now, but I think I did that a minute or so ago. I have from the beginning, which
Hmm.
isn't apparently giving any
Hmm.
results. Um, hmm.
Well, if you just wanted to move your slides as you go,
Oh, I have been.
or
Uh,
like right now, I can see the second one.
oh, you can in this position here?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Hmm.
All right. Well, I guess we could do it that way. As long as it doesn't distract you all, that's fine. It'd be a lot easier to follow, I
Hmm.
suppose. Let me try one more time to see
Okay.
if this will work here. If it doesn't, then we'll go back. Can you see the second one now
Um,
with a list of?
it still has all the slides to the left.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
So,
darn. That's
I know
strange.
it is. Um,
Um, okay, we'll
but
try
yeah,
one.
if you just arrow down for your next one, because I can see it just fine.
Okay.
It's just your PowerPoint info
Right.
is around
You'll
it.
see
Yeah,
the whole thing.
yeah. But
Okay, well,
I can still see the slide. So
okay.
yeah.
All right. And so I guess I'm not sure why it's not doing this
Hmm.
correctly, but we'll just go ahead and go that way.
Yeah. See,
Um,
I can read that just fine.
okay. All
Mhm.
right. We'll do that then, rather than delay this. I'm sorry. I'm not
No, you're
sure what's
fine.
going wrong with this.
You're fine.
Um,
It's always
sure.
technology, but I can see it perfectly fine.
Okay.
Mhm.
All righty. Well, I will back up here just one second then and show you that list again of the different uh, institutions
Mhm.
that we do have records for.
Great.
Um, and, as I said, boys' school, women's prison, the various state prisons, and the reformatory. And then we have on our website, this will take you to the collections. It's a very long address for our Research Indiana Index. So I'll just start you here at in.gov/IARA. And if you choose Archives Collections at the top, it'll take you to the Research Indiana Indexes, which is the best place to start for doing research on individuals. And then if you look at the different categories we have here, you'll notice that if you're doing research on entire families, and quite often that's going to be the case, if you have someone in prison, you might find the children are in orphanages, so you'll want to check out the children's category there, and also pardons and paroles. And even your Henry does have a pardon file at the State Archives. So we could pull that and see what was written in about him. Those pardon files are chock full, usually, of information and people requesting they be pardoned, people requesting they stay in prison, and quite often information from the prisoner themselves, their story or letters requesting, a pardon or what their version of what happened about a particular crime. So those are kind of two good companion groups there for the Department of Corrections records. But if you choose the Department of Corrections tab, then you can choose on the left-hand side, you can choose which prison you're researching. And of course, in this case, we are looking at Prison South and then later the Indiana State Reformatory. And so here's an example of the result for James Trimble, who is the prisoner who kind of started this research into the prisoners when Francis had written about asking about, where was he buried at the prison. And I'll have to say, until that time, I did not realize the cemetery was missing. It had a find a grave page, and I didn't know that, its location was unknown, so I was a little baffled by that. But here is a close-up of his entry in the prison book. And I show you this so you get an idea that the information in the books over the years does change. And he had found a mention in a newspaper about James Trumbull dying at the prison, just a small article that mentioned that, and that I think it also said he was buried in the prison. I thought, well, if there's one article, maybe there's another. And so I did a search on newspapers.com and or newspaper archive. I can't remember at the time, but give them both a plug there because they're great resources. And found this huge article on James Trimble that told his life story. And they were using him as an example for a temperance movement. And I think they did this because he knew he was dying and he had been acting as a lecturer around the country trying to keep people, you know, from using alcohol. Yet he somehow never quite was able to conquer that himself, and he knew that. And I think in his death, he wanted to give his story, about the problems he had and hope that that would come to some good result. So to start the cemetery research, part of this, there were three main questions. Who died at the prison? Who was buried there? And where is the cemetery located? So I'll start with those first two questions because you kind of do those together. I thought, well, we've got these indexes, and we can look at Indiana State Prison South records and the reformatory. And over the years, our volunteers and our um, staff have been indexing these records, and we've added them to the Research Indiana Index. You can go online and search for died as a key word for either one of these and come up with a list of results. And in this first instance, notice that there were 517 results for died in the notes field of different prisoners who were there, and that is for the State Prison South. Fewer results like that for when in the years of the reformatory show up. Now, this doesn't mean that that's everyone. It just means that those notes were made in those indexes that were used by our staff and our volunteers to create these tables. And so it at least gives us a starting point that way. And sorry, this has gotten a little bit out of order. So in taking the access databases that we use and then convert into our Research Indiana Index, I pulled those two tables and filtered out everyone who died and then combined all of those into an Excel spreadsheet. And using some of the information that Diane had sent about the research she and Eden were doing, added what I knew from that if they were buried in the prison, but I haven't added all the other information yet for those that we know who weren't. And you can see here that we come up with over 700, almost 800 different people who are just mentioned as having died in both of those institutions. Again, that may not be the full number. And then for my part of trying to help in this and trying to determine what resources we could use, I went through some of those register books and looked at these people and went to their page in the register book. And sometimes we'll find, where it'll say died of such and such. This person at the top here died of basically like a stroke nowadays we would think of it as. And this was December 22nd in 1844. It doesn't mention where he's buried at. Later, prison registers are expanded. They give a bit more descriptive information about the prisoners and will tell some information, typically how they're discharged. Did they die there? Were they released by expiration of sentence, or were they pardoned by the governor or by one of the boards? And so that information will be carried there. And there's a close-up of another prisoner, Larkin Langford, who I recently looked up, and he died also. Note there that it does not mention if he is buried in the prison cemetery or not. And quite often that's the case. Once in a while it'll say, yes, it does mention that they're buried in the prison cemetery. So I got curious about how many of these people did have death certificates, and Unfortunately, I've not been able to continue too much of that research, but I know Eden's been working on that too. So, but notice with the death certificates, here's some examples. It will say that they were residence was, at the reformatory, and it will usually tell where they were buried at or if their body was sent away. And let's give you another example here. This one clearly says place of burial is the reformatory cemetery, and this one is in 1902. And just show you some more examples. Sometimes you have people who are in a private cemetery, and that will be listed on those death certificates that they are sent off to, say, another city, and it'll sometimes even give the name of the cemetery. Now, if you see death certificates that mention Bloomington, Indiana, that typically means they were sent to the State Anatomical Board because IU was in charge of that at that time. This came about after the creation of the State Anatomical Board, which was basically created to kind of get control over all the grave robbing that was going on in Indiana, because ghouls, or grave robbers as they were, had a pretty lucrative business taking recently deceased people from their graves and selling them to medical schools. And it got so out of hand that by 1903, when the story kind of broke about how outrageous it was getting around central Indiana and the surrounding states, Indiana decided to create that board and then, provide an actual way for medical students to get cadavers for their research, without having to break laws and use people to go into cemeteries and steal bodies. So that did kind of change things. But again, that reference to Bloomington might be that they actually were from Bloomington, and if you see that in the history, you might note that, okay, yeah, that person's from Bloomington. It doesn't necessarily mean that they went to the anatomical board, but typically that is what that means. The other question that we're still looking for and still trying to find out about is, where was the cemetery, or how many cemeteries were there? There's some references to cemeteries in some of the state reports and things like that, and some of the activities going on with selling some of the property. So I was looking at different resources that we had for this, and one of the things that I checked were our aerial photographs to see if there was any indication at all that you could see some form of a cemetery. And so I looked at those back to the 1930s. And so then I also looked at different information on the sale of lands in some of the books that are available. And these I just happened to pull from Google Books and clip some things. Sorry, my dog is I knew he would do that, but he's a feisty little fellow. Notice here that some of the land was originally purchased in 1842 that was supposed to be part of that land was used for a cemetery. We know in 1847 it was moved from the Jeffersonville side to Clarksville. And then in 1875, there was an act that directed the sale of some of the land, which included the cemetery, and that's mentioned in some of these resources. And we know that sale was finalized in 1877, but there's notation that the state legislature was supposed to provide for the removal of the bodies. Now, we don't know, does that mean that they were supposed to come to, bring those bodies over to the new location, whichever place that was chosen, we're not sure. I apologize for Rocky. He is a little demon, but he's also a sweetheart. And so looking at more records, there is reference to the fence around the prison actually being stolen, which indicates that the prison cemetery was outside the prison walls. Now, I'm not sure if this is the fence around the original cemetery that they were selling off in 1877, or if this is a new location for a cemetery. And so then in 1888, there is the mentioned in the documentary journal that they are building a fence around the cemetery and that it was badly needed. So
Seven deaths in
there is no indication in some of the early prison maps and layouts of the prison of where the cemetery might be.
Between now and October 23.
And again, nothing shows up on aerial photographs, which I took a look at here. And so that's kind of basically where we're at. We're still in limbo over the exact location or locations. And I hope that this at least gives you some indication of the types of records you can find with the state archives and where to begin searching, for prisoners with our Research Indiana Index and using those actual prison registers and also the pardon and parole files. So, and then I had a slide for questions, but I'm not sure. I'll hand this back over and
Peg nails.
I'll let you all take it from there.
And they no doubt did not have metal pens.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. So
that worked out fine, I think.
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
Yep.
I'm so sorry about that. I have no idea why this won't share correctly, but
that's quite okay.
It's technology.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So we had two questions in here. One is Rex. He said, looking for an orphan train rider after 1880 in Carroll County. He lost them around 1886 and thinks Albert, Margett, Maggert from Ohio may have ended up in prison. So what should be Rex's first step?
I would suggest visiting our Research Indiana Index and see if you find him listed either in the boys' school or probably the reformatory. Also check those children's records because our index for children covers foster care files, and that includes the early Children's Aid Society, which does include orphan train riders and also children who are through the Board of State Charities. We have over 10,000 files for kids in the system between 1892 and 1910. Now, I'm not sure why, but that if they weren't in the system by 1910, we don't usually have a file. It doesn't mean their files cut off at 1910. They go all the way up to the 20s and 30s sometimes with information about the kids. But there was some change in that record-keeping system that if they weren't in the system by 1910, we just don't have much for them unless they ended up in one of the other institutions we have records for.
Okay. And I did share the link to the site on our in the comments. And then a second question we had was Phil. He was wondering, would you go down the same road looking for a person that was institutionalized for medical reasons? Do you know?
You could, particularly, you might want to look at our inquest in the court records on the Research Indiana Index and see if they're there. That doesn't begin to cover all the various institutions, but if you have an idea where they lived at the time they were institutionalized, or if they an indication of which institution they went to. There were quite a few in Indiana in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Then we might be able to help you find something. Now, actual list of patients and patient files are not available online due to confidentiality. And you do have to prove relationship to hospital patients. but we can certainly help you look for those records if you send us an email.
Vicki,
I
if I can throw in,
Mhm.
at least up through the 1930s, if there was a judge ordered, which had to be done, to institutionalize someone at Madison or at the Women's Hospital in Indianapolis, then it was published in the newspaper as part of the court reportings. And it gave the
Yes,
name of the person who was their guardian. So you could use newspaper archives, Hoosier Chronicles, to check out the county seat newspapers. That'd be most likely where it was listed.
that would be a great way to start. Yeah, definitely, because those inquests are public record. They're court records and are considered public records.
And
It's once they get into the institution, then that everything becomes confidential.
Right.
if they did something interesting, outlandish, to get that, to get the initial hearing started, that's going to be in the newspaper. I can think of 3 people in particular that ended up in state institutions that one killed somebody, one suddenly went from being a law-abiding citizen to starting to steal everything, and another one chased her stepfather down the street with a knife. And
That would certainly be newsworthy.
yeah, and you know, in every case there was something going on health-wise, and yet they were all institutionalized because that was the only way they had to treat that serious of thing at that time.
We also had a young lady who refused to wear women's clothes, and they institutionalized her for a short period of time until the doctors determined that there wasn't anything mentally wrong with her. She just really didn't like dresses. And this was in the late 1800s.
Well, I'm with her because I rarely wear dresses either.
Annie Edwards.
Oh, that was a wealth of information.
Yeah, it was.
And Mr. Burner's story, that is just
Mhm.
terrific.
Yeah.
All that in the newspaper. Oh my
Yes,
goodness.
I really wish I could track that clock down. I'd just love to know if it's still there. You have to stop and think about it. I know where the family lived. Their house got hit by the 37 flood, and that clock was still around in 1947, so it survived the flood.
Wow. Oh my goodness.
It's a good
That's
mystery.
So fascinating.
Yeah. Well, thank you everyone for attending tonight's event. We've learned a lot, and thank you so much for the guest speakers, especially Diane, because you recommended this topic. And so we were very excited, jumped on it as soon as she mentioned it. And you can watch it again, and it'll be on Facebook, and then it will also be on YouTube within 24 hours. And so go ahead and check that out. We do want to make a announcement that we have a special Facebook Live that we're doing on Monday, September 16th. Normally we just do once a month, but we thought, you know what, why not do it twice this month? Because we have a special guest, Bradley Jansen, who will be sharing an intriguing story behind his article that he wrote on his ancestor, Ann Taylor of Virginia in Indiana, and it's actually featured in the autumn issue of the journal. So we're excited to have him come. He's going to talk about his journey and stuff like that. So be sure you're following us so that you will get notified when we go live for that topic.
And if you aren't a member and you join, you can have access to the journal. It just came out 2 days ago.
Yeah.
With the article. And Ann Taylor came from Virginia to Indiana. So Bradley and his relatives who did the research, they're going to talk about how they followed her trail up here.
It'll be a good one. You guys won't want to miss it. Just like this one tonight. This was very, very good.
I know. I mean, we're double booking these now.
I know.
This is great. Really awesome. And we appreciate your time and sharing your knowledge. And, it's just a treat to learn these things.
Vicki and Eden did the hard work. Yay.
I think you guys all do hard work.
Yes.
I think
So
Ethan-
Vicki, I'm estimating it'll be 6 to 8 months, maybe 9, and I'll have us done through October of 1923. So then I can start double checking with death certificates and let you know any other I added. I was intrigued. You had one slide that said that there were 7 deaths in the last year of the Indiana Prison South. And so far I've only found 2. So that means I've got 5 more to find.
Okay, yeah, they list their names, so in that report. So I can get you that part of the slide too. I mean,
Okay.
it's a different clip, but it does give all their names, so that might help.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Oh, no problem. My pleasure. And if you all want to, pursue Mr. Berner, I'd be glad to do that and pull that pardon file for him too. See what it might say.
Neat.
All right. It'd be fun to
Okay.
see.
Awesome.
Great.
Thank you
Well,
all.
thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you all.
Thank you.